Hi, this is Jeff Curto, and welcome to episode number 32 of Camera Position, a podcast about the creative side of photography. This week's episode of Camera Position takes us, I guess you could say, out into the field. I had an exhibition of my work recently at Waubonsee Community College in Sugar Grove, Illinois, and they kindly invited me to give a gallery talk about that work last Tuesday, the 19th of September. And I took along a little recording device and recorded my comments and thought I would pass them along to you as episode number 32 of Camera Position. You will note a couple of minutes into this presentation that I paused and showed a short QuickTime movie slideshow of my work to give the audience in the gallery a bit of a background about what the work was. I've edited that part out of my comments here because otherwise you'd be sort of sitting there listening to muffled music. I have, in fact, though, posted the QuickTime movie in a small web streaming format on the cameraposition.com blog. So if you're interested in taking a look at that, you can visit the cameraposition.com blog posting for episode number 32. So without any more commentary, we'll join the gallery talk at Waubonsee Community College on September 19th at 2 p.m.
Thanks for having me. I really appreciate being here. This is an exciting opportunity, and I'm gonna go ahead and spill the beans to those of you who are aspiring artists who want exhibitions. I'll give you the story about how come I'm here, because I think it's actually significant. It turns out that somebody was supposed to be exhibiting in this space, and I don't know what happened. Something bad happened, and they weren't able to do it. And lo and behold, because Martine Stuckey knows me and knows that I'm a photographer, and knew that it was fairly likely that I might have some work ready because I've been sort of exhibiting here and there and so forth and so on, dropped me an email, said, "Can you exhibit next week?" And I said, maybe. So it for me kind of goes back to that old adage: don't try to get ready, just stay ready. So if you're a little bit agile and a little bit kind of on the balls of your feet as opposed to being back on your heels all the time, being able to be agile enough to have an exhibition is great, because the work has been out of the house at various points, but not as often as I like. It's never out as often as I like. So I think it's great, and I appreciate the opportunity, and also appreciate the opportunity to come here and talk to you guys. What I want to do, I've got this new little gizmo, which I've never used before. Never use new technology. This is my new thing. Never use new technology for the first time. Yeah, oh, good, it'll work when it really matters. So I've got a new little clicker. So I'm very excited about my little clicker, because I like to walk around, and standing next to the computer was going to give me the wiggies. So. Here's what I want to do for us this afternoon, and sort of give you a little overview of where we're going to go. A little introduction to what I do, a quick overview of how I got to where I am, and we'll look at a few specific images, and maybe at some point turn the lights on and be able to look at what's on the walls here. And then I certainly want to invite question and answer if anybody has any questions at the end, or even as we're kind of going. What I really want to do first off is just kind of give you an introduction to the work in a little short slideshow sort of thing, which will run on its own here for about 3.5 minutes. So what I wanted to give you a sense of with that was a sort of general sense of where I've been and what I've been doing, in a way that kind of could barrage you with a bunch of imagery all at once. So you'd have this sort of idea of the range of what I'm doing, and both the sort of wideish range, and also, if you were sort of thinking about it, a kind of a narrower range of things. So one of the things that I want you to kind of think about, or that I'd like to talk about, I guess, a little bit, is the sort of path to how I got to what I'm doing right now. this is the result, what you're seeing here is a result of a 17-year project, which is a pretty long time to be engaged in pursuing what appears to be a singular subject. And so I kind of have given a kind of a bullet point suggestion of my path. I began photographing in Italy in 1989, and how many people in the room have been to Italy or another Mediterranean country? About a third of you maybe. It's really beautiful. Much of it is extraordinarily beautiful, and it has this sort of romantic quality to it that a photographer is fairly logically going to respond to. So my first response was pretty pictures of these beautiful and very lovely places and things that I saw. And 17 years later, that initial response to beauty has really turned into a sort of a passionate response in some ways. But what I began to discover, I'd always been sort of interested in architecture. Architecture always was something that I was kind of was jazzed about and excited about in general. And I had done some commercial architectural photography at some distant past time, but it was pretty dull stuff. Warehouses and, office buildings and, not very exciting kinds of things. But what I began to recognize was that there was a vernacular response, that what was happening as people were building these things over centuries of time in Italy was this response that was about trying to improve a situation of where somebody was, structurally or environmentally. And one of the things that I began to recognize was that the Italians' method of structuring their environment, their place, was that their structures were of the land, that the stones that made the buildings were stones that came from the land, that the structures were put in particular places in the landscape, not because it was necessarily the most functional spot to place it, but because it was the most lovely place to place it. And if you contrast that, for example, with the way in which we live our lives here, on my way here today, I passed at least 2 new strip malls being built that had nothing to do with how nice they would look there, but rather, making sure that there was a dry cleaner within 500 feet of everybody in the United States. So what happened was that I kind of progressed from this path of I wanted to take pretty pictures of things down through a sort of understanding that what was happening was that people were making things that were important to them and that were a part of their own environment, but also that there were some really amazing people who made these things. Somewhere there was a man or a group of men who very carefully carved these grapes and grapevines into this column and created that column in this sort of beautiful Baroque shape that we see in this photograph. And Joe had introduced me and said, yes, I have a Bachelor of Fine Arts and a Master of Fine Arts degree, so I did my lumps in art history and have, all of those slide memorization classes under my belt that I know that some of you have probably done, and learned my bits and pieces of architectural history, but I didn't learn as much as I now know because I've really taken this whole sort of idea of architecture and structure and vernacular expression and really kind of run with it, and have a fairly large amount now of sort of background information that may or may not show up in the photographs, but background information about architecture of the Romanesque period and the Renaissance and the Baroque period. Ultimately, what I'm aiming at are images that have a timeless quality, which is why, and we'll get to why there are some pictures of people in the room here, but in the slideshow that you saw, there weren't any photographs of people and there are no people in any of the pictures. And my objective for that is really to give you a sense that this is a picture that could have been made yesterday or a decade ago or 20 decades ago. Obviously photography, we couldn't have too terribly long ago, but the idea of being able to make these pictures that don't really have a sense of a time period. So dress would factor in, certainly attitude, everything from physical appearance through hairstyles and so forth and so on of any people who would be in these pictures would sort of change the way we saw things. Another important thing, and I don't like to talk too much about technology when I talk about the kind of photographs that I do, but I think it's important to understand how these pictures come about. I use a camera that looks very much like this one. Here it is on its tripod. This is in Venice. And this, by the way, if anybody ever goes to Venice, ask me, because this is about, anybody been to Venice? Tell me a thing about Venice and people. A lot of people in Venice, right? It's really crowded. Crowded. This is 100 yards off of St. Mark's Square, and there's nobody there. It's unbelievable. I mean, it's like completely quiet. Fabulous place. And a really interesting photographic space, too. So I'm using a camera that produces a negative on a piece of 4x5 inch film. I use black and white film. There is an advantage to not looking like a tourist with a Nikon, because what's happened over the time is that as I'm standing there with this huge camera and a giant camera bag, and it's the kind of camera, for those of you who don't know large format equipment, you have to have a hood over your head to be able to see the picture on the back of in the back of the camera. I've met a lot of people. A lot of people come up to me, ask me what I'm doing. I've given a lot of view camera lessons in Italian, which has been interesting because I had to learn a lot of vocabulary I didn't know. But the idea of being able to meet people by virtue of the machine, and the machine kind of connoting a sense of seriousness that the tourist with a Nikon may or may not have. I mean, you might be just as serious with a Nikon, but there's something about this big wooden camera that gives me a sort of a license, in a way, to be in a particular place and do a particular thing. And the fact that I'm really slow is a big deal. I might, in a day, if I have a really big day, I might take 30 pictures. But that's me humping and working hard, really, really moving through the day and really kind of making a lot of photographs. So I don't tend to make very many photographs. This past summer when I was in Italy, I think I shot a much larger number of pieces of film than I typically do, maybe 600 over a period of 3 weeks. So I really worked quite hard. But what happens is that the camera, by slowing me down, forces me to make a lot more decisions about what I take a photograph of, why, and how. And an individual photograph might take me as short a period of time as 3 or 4 minutes is about my record, maybe, of getting the camera out of the bag and on the tripod and focused and metered. And 4 minutes is probably pretty quick for me. Up to a long time, half hour, an hour, 2 hours sometimes, depending on what I'm waiting to have happen. Sometimes it's waiting for people to leave a space so that I can deal with that. And again, the idea that I meet people because of the equipment. And that's been a really huge advantage for me, because I've met a lot of really interesting people, first of all, just sort of people that I'm still in correspondence with because they're just interesting folks. But I've also met a lot of people who are very interested in photography. Oh, I just got mail, apparently. I forgot to turn that off. And thank you for the wireless network here at Wabansie Community College. But I've also met a lot of people interested in photography, and a lot of people interested in architecture, and a lot of people interested in American photography, and so forth and so on. And so the camera, in many ways, just the object, has been this sort of ticket, almost, to get me into places and situations that I might not otherwise get into if I had a standard issue Nikon or Canon or something hanging around my neck. When I titled this exhibition, the Evidence of Hands, the Mediated Landscape of Italy, what my objective was to talk about, and we tend to know the word mediation as negotiation, right? There's a mediator who comes in and takes two sides and helps get them together when they are apart in some way. And I wanted to use this sort of different definition, or at least a different way that the word mediated can mean. I was really interested in the idea of, right up front, explaining that what I'm interested in is the idea of how space gets altered, and that alteration of space is usually some sort of a compromise between the thing that the space needs to be and the way in which the space ultimately looks. So what I want to do is just sort of tour us through a few of these images, and obviously with the projector and everything, they don't look quite the same. And some of these are pictures that are in the room, and some of them, like this one, are not in the room. So you'll get a sort of an idea when you can compare the pictures that are in the room to the projected image. The contrast on the projector is a little high, but that's okay. Not a big deal. The idea that the space that's being created doesn't need to be any particular thing. This particular structure is actually a public palazzo, is what they would call it, but it's a public building with public offices, probably built somewhere in the late 1300s or the early 1400s, and has to it this quality that one might associate with a building that is more of a building that's devoted to spiritual matters, a church, some sort of baptismal place or something like that. But the idea that it didn't matter whether it was a secular place or a religious place, that regardless, the builders of this place wanted to make it very, very beautiful. And in many ways, historically, thinking back to the history of art, this is a place in time where God and man are coming more together, and we have a sort of sense that they're supporting one another in some way in the effort of making these things. So, and this is an interesting place. It's a place I've been back to photograph almost every year for the last 12 or 13 or so from the time that I first saw it, and it's a church called San Antimo, and it's sort of in the middle of nowhere in Tuscany, literally like not next to any one big city or anything. There's a really little town right next to it. It is one of the oldest Romanesque churches in Italy of any kind. It is still active and has a group of monks who are still living in the sort of monastery off to the side of the church, and they say Mass 3 times a day in chanted Latin. And I'm not a Catholic, but I've learned a lot about Catholicism through the experience of looking at all of these religious structures. And much of the church is created out of either a kind of a marble travertine stone, which is what you see here, or is carved out of alabaster. And in the interior of the church, some of the columns are actually alabaster, the columns that hold up parts of the interior of the church, and the light that comes into the interior of the church makes these things kind of almost glow. It's really quite remarkable. And there are also details on the outside of the church that are made of a combination. They must have, the only way I can figure it is that they must have laminated bits and pieces of stone onto one another that are made out of combinations of different kinds of stone. And it is, to me, and you can see actually this column is partly out of alabaster. It had an alabaster covering on it at one time. To me, it's one of the most spiritual places I've ever been, and it also gives me this sense of how important the decorative element was, even back in the days of the Romanesque, when decoration was usually quite modest and more symbolic than the Baroque era, which really kind of gets at this whole sort of woohoo kind of attitude of architecture, right? So this is in Ortigia, outside of the main cathedral. Ortigia is an island off the coast of Siracusa, or Syracuse, being one of the oldest cities in Italy, way back to the Greek times, and Ortigia is this island that was strategic off the coast of that, but didn't really experience an architectural flowering until the Baroque. So we have these remarkably intricate Baroque palaces. This figure is out in front of the cathedral in Ortigia, and the space across the piazza here is a public palace. And the whole idea is the way in which these two things really kind of come together. The sort of the public and the spiritual, the secular and the religious, and how those two things are dealt with in some way. Leaving architecture aside, the other thing that kind of is just amazing to me is that it isn't just about decorating the built space. Maybe I can say this in a different way. That what I began to realize, I first, those of you who've raised your hand and said, you've been to Italy or you've been to, southern France or Greece or any of these other places that have this amazing pastoral beauty to them, right? I mean, you look out at the landscape and it's very peaceful, and that rolling landscape of Tuscany is so incredible, and that's where this image was made. But the idea, at first, as you look out, you say, "Oh, wow, it's really beautiful. It's untouched and pristine." And over time, I began to realize that no, it's not. This is land that's been farmed for thousands of years, manipulated for thousands of years, and carefully constructed over a long period of time to do a particular thing. And the part that I began to recognize was that things like that tree being planted in that space in such a way that as you went down this particular path, and this was a sort of a walking path intended to provide sort of expansive views as well as a sort of a forested environment, that tree has been planted in that particular place for a particular reason, to be an exclamation mark in the mid-distance and to act as a sort of compositional element in the person's view of the world, not the photographer's view of the world. I just happened to be in the right place at the right time to make a photograph of that, or to stand in the right place at the right time. But the person who planted that tree understood that tree was going to be in a particular place to be seen in a particular way by the people who would pass by that space. And I also think, and this is a relatively new photograph, so I'm just sort of getting used to it in terms of whether it's really functional or not to me, although I think it's working. I think I'm okay with it. But it also comes down to the way in which these objects, these spaces, manipulate light. And one of the things that I've noticed, and I'm trying to remember if this picture is in, and you saw it in the slideshow, this one, I might have it in here, I can't remember now. This picture, yes, thank you very much for pointing to it. It's the side of a church in Montepulciano in Tuscany called San Biagio. And that image and this image, I think, have a lot to do with one another in that I think that it's not unlikely that the architects who planned that church understood that the positioning of the building would cast certain shadows in certain ways at certain times of the day and times of the year. And while I don't know that they were thinking at all about that relative to this wrought iron railing, I think that the way in which the railing sculpts this space of this little piazza here is pretty remarkable. So I really begin to think about it like as if every spot had been touched, had been felt in some way, and altered in some fashion. This is also an Ortigia. This is the sort of vestibule of the church where we just saw a statue of a guy a minute ago. And there's a wall that rises up sort of over here that has a bunch of piercings in it. And so that's where these odd sort of shadows are coming from. And this is a situation, you know, those of you who in the room who are photographers can probably relate to this, that I was all set up, you know, I saw this, I thought it was really amazing. I love the light that was coming through here. And I got my camera set up, and now that you know that it's kind of a, you know, cumbersome sort of process, it takes a few minutes to get it set up. And because I wanted to stand in a particular place, I was literally backed up against the wall and trying to see through the camera. And I get everything all set, and just as I'm about to trip the shutter on the camera, a woman rolls in with her stroller and parks her stroller right there. You know, and then takes her baby out and goes into the church for an indeterminate amount of time. You know, I don't know whether she was going in to look at it or going in to celebrate Mass. It's hard to tell. So I waited and I waited, and it was late in the day, and the sunlight that was casting these amazing, you know, highlights and shadows was starting to alter itself. And I took a couple of pieces of film just in case, you know, figuring that a picture of this with the stroller is different, you know, but I don't want the stroller because it's clearly like a, you know, a particular kind of stroller that would date the picture in a particular way. And then I'm thinking, okay, well, I don't typically use Photoshop to take things out of the pictures, but I suppose I could do that because I knew that it was going to be a picture that I would really like a lot. Fortunately, before the light changed too terribly much, the woman did come back out. And so I have 3 negatives with the stroller in it as the light moved, and then 1 without the stroller. And I wasn't forced to make that sort of moral decision about whether I'd alter the image. And actually, while I'm on that topic, an interesting thing, especially for those of you in the room who are photographers, is that all of these prints are digital prints. They're all printed in inkjet on various and sundry printers, mostly all on various and sundry Epson printers, probably the best way to say it, all on high rag content or 100% rag content paper. And I can, if anybody's interested later, I can talk more about the technical bits and pieces. But a few of the images were printed on Epson 3000 printer. Most of them were printed on either an Epson 2200 or a 4000. So, the farther along I've gotten, the more I've begun to discover that it is these tiny little details of things that begin to become more interesting to me. The expansive view is not very interesting anymore. I'm much more interested in very intimate views. Even the landscape pictures have begun to become close-up images. And really this tree picture that's right over here, right at the entrance here, is probably a harbinger of that. That's, I think, 1996 maybe, something like that. 97, I can't remember. I'd have to look at the thing, but it was the first thing that began to show me that you could make this landscape image that didn't necessarily look out over an expansive view, but and if you think about that photograph, it's an olive grove, and the olive trees are very carefully constructed to be olive-producing machines. Same deal with the vineyards, same deal with the sunflowers, same deal with the sheep in the pasture. On one level, they're beautiful and pastoral. On another level, they're very carefully thought through. So I'll talk about that sheep picture in a second. And this is that same Abbey, San Antimo. And this is a little harder to see. I think this image is in the show here. Pretty sure it is. But here's another one of these things. You know, this is not happenstance. It's not sort of a coincidence that that tree is in the window. It's all about carefully constructing every aspect of the visual experience, from this, you know, gorgeous portico all the way through what's in the interior of the building and so forth and so on, but also all the way through what somebody sees as they look at the scenery. And then a very recent development that is evident here in this room, and I think is worth mentioning, is that at some point I began to recognize that if my primary interest was in the people who made things, that I probably ought to start looking at the people who do make things. And this has been a very interesting sort of I guess development is probably the best way to describe it, in that while my background in photography has had very little to do with portraiture, yeah, I did some commercial portraiture at some point in the way distant past. Very little of what I've done over the years in these thousands of photographs that I've made in this 17-year journey have been portraits. But I began to recognize that there was something that could expand on this idea of hands that make things, hands that make decisions. And I've begun to make some portraits, I think with varying success. I'm not completely convinced that this is working 100% yet it's really interesting for me to see. This is the first time I've actually seen these portrait images in an exhibition space with the rest of the pictures, and I think that's kind of an interesting thing. I came out here a while back to look at the show right after it was hung, and very interesting for me to see the way in which that works together. But it also gives me this other sort of outlet for all these people that I'm meeting, right? I mean, I'm talking to these people anyway, oftentimes spending hours. I mean, the last guy, the Coppersmith guy, I've probably spent maybe 4 or 5 hours talking with him just about his history of being a coppersmith and so forth and so on. And then, we went and had a drink in this guy's bar, and, so that whole idea, and you can sort of see, where I end up. I end up in the bar and the wine cellar and so forth and so on. But then there's this guy. This guy's new. He's 97 years old. And here's what I keep thinking every time I look at this picture. I said, when I'm 97, I want to make sure that I can still tie a tie that perfectly. Look at this guy. Isn't he just fabulous? He's just so terrific. And, he had just a lot of interesting stories about where he'd lived in this town all his life and had been a shopkeeper that had a shoe store. So just a really interesting person. So, and that is all I have. Other than I did want to just point out that I have a website, jeffcurto.com, and I also have actually a couple of different podcasts that I do. And if you don't know what a podcast is, it's these downloadable audio programs that you can either download one at a time, or you can set up a piece of software. Many people use iTunes to automatically download them over when I produce them. And Camera Position is a podcast that I do that is like a 6-minute version of what I've just been doing, talking about photography, sometimes mine, sometimes other photographers' work, and that has been really interesting to do. And I've now got a whole lot of different content. I've done 31 episodes of Camera Position, and I'm also, and some of you are COD students and know this, that I'm also podcasting my history of photography class that I teach once a week, and that's been really interesting too, because I now have literally thousands of people all over the world listening to my history of photography class, which is really kind of funny. And if you go to either one of these websites, but more logically Camera Position, you can find a link to the History of Photography podcast if you're interested in learning more about that stuff. So, and that's kind of all.
Well, thank you very much for listening to this episode of Camera Position. I hope you gained a little bit of insight into what it is that I do as a photographer, and talking about one's work is always an important part of the process of being a photographer. I'm sorry I've been sort of absent from the helm for a little bit longer than I normally would be for my episodes of Camera Position, but I had a really busy week with this trip to Santa Fe, which I'll recap at a later point in another episode of Camera Position to come. And also, golly, thank you so much for those of you who are new subscribers, because my subscription level doubled and my bandwidth on my server was at capacity, and it took me a few days to unravel that and figure out a spot to put some of these episodes so that I wouldn't be shut down. I came awful close there. So thank you very much. I appreciate those of you who are subscribing, and I will look forward to seeing you on the next episode of Camera Position, a podcast about the creative side of photography.
photocastnetwork.com, your photography resource in the potosphere. photocastnetwork.com